Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody watching this Able and Imre webinar. Welcome to it, and we hope that you will find it useful. John, just to check if you're recording the webinar, please, so it could be available for download later on. If you could go to the first slide, please. For those of you who are watching and unfamiliar with Able and Imre, we are a leading firm of European and UK patent and trademark attorneys with clients covering a wide range of technologies, sectors and sizes. Our purpose is to look after our clients' ideas so that they can focus on the things that are important to them. We care about our clients and take the time to build an understanding of their world and their aims that help us develop long-term relationships with them. We collaborate not only with our clients, but across our teams to help provide our clients with the relevant expertise and the experience to match the task. And dare I say, we have a reputation for finding a way to achieve the results that our clients desire when others may have been less successful. Our contact details will be available at the end of this talk if you would like to discuss with us in more detail. So if we could go to the next slide, please, John. In this webinar, our aim is to share with you some guidance and some recommendations about how to manage an IP portfolio, particularly one that includes patents and patent applications. This is not just from the perspective of outside attorneys, but we have on the panel today a highly experienced in-house IP and licensing manager from one of the world's 5 largest contract and design manufacturing organizations, who has a wealth of experience in how to manage IP for real. Now, patents are expensive and complicated, and getting them takes a long time, and they last a long time, 20 years typically, at a cost. All too often, patents are seen as a cost rather than a judicious investment in protecting the invariably much greater investment a business has made in developing its new products and processes. In times of economic difficulty, such as the one that we're about to enter, I fear, it's tempting and sometimes necessary to cut costs and drop patents and applications, or even not to file them in the first place. But unless that's done rationally and methodically, there is a great risk of harming the value of the business and its longer term success. And it's not just about patents. Companies developing new products and processes need to ensure they have freedom to operate, and this needs to be taken into account when preparing an IP budget. As we will explain on this webinar, establishing freedom to operate also forms an important part of a company's patent filing and prosecution strategy. It's important to manage IP well at any time to ensure the investment is and remains focused on assets or business needs of the greatest value. But of course, the need for effective management is heightened at times of economic crisis. Before I go any further, I would just like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that on the screen in front of you, there is a Q&A button to press. If you'd like to ask questions, please do so. We as panelists they'll be visible to us throughout, and we will either answer them in written form in the box, or we will save them up to answer at the end. Just by way of a brief introduction of the panel today, my name is Julian Crump. I'm a partner with the firm Able and Imre, who I've been here just over 2 years in the Bath office. I'm a European and chartered UK patent attorney, and I have been in practice for oh my word, just over 30 years. I have a degree in natural sciences, and my practice covers a wide range of technologies, but with a particular focus on diagnostics and pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, but quite a lot of other things besides over the years. Also on the screen, you'll find my colleague, Jim Pearson. Jim, if you'd like to give a wave, thank you. Jim has been with Able and Imre an awful lot longer than I have. He joined in 1994, straight after completing a degree in physics at Bristol University. And he preferred the idea of going into IP than working in the family timber business. He became a partner in A&I in 2001 and senior partner, in fact, in 2018. He's married with 4 daughters, 3 of whom are now teenagers, all living under one roof during the COVID lockdown. Vested interest in women having equal opportunities is not the only reason to have an active interest in supporting IP inclusive, Jim. Jim is qualified as both a trademark and patent attorney, and with a wide range of expertise on all patents, trademarks and registered designs, but with a bigger focus on patents. His technical fields of expertise are fairly wide, but mostly focus on advanced engineering of one sort or another. And he's had plenty of experience over the years working with businesses large and small, ranging from multinationals with their own in-house departments to SMEs, all of whom want, of course, the best value for money from their IP, often within tight budgets. Also joining me today, I'm delighted to welcome Arthur Lallemont. Arthur, give it a little wave.
Hello.
Arthur brings with him many years of consultancy experience in advising medtech, biotechnology, and pharmaceutical companies on threats and opportunities identified in the patent landscape on IP strategy and road mapping. These competencies have benefited in the past HVivo Services Limited through the management of IP prosecution, but also guiding their research and development activities. Arthur now works in-house at Bestpac Europe Limited, which is a Recipharm-owned company, and as I mentioned, one of the five largest contract and design manufacturing organizations in the world. Arthur helps them to navigate the inhalers and auto-injectors patent thickets, whilst also managing their licensing activities. Arthur has an MBA from the SKMA Business School in Sophia Antipolis, and an MSc in molecular biology from the University of Toulouse. Right, so if we could now move to the next slide. The order in which we're going to take things today is as follows. First of all, we're just going to take a quick look at what's happened in the past during periods of recession in the UK to see what's happened on patenting activities, to see if there's anything that we can learn from that. And I'll deal with that. And then after that, which won't take very long, we're going to move on to questions around how much does it cost to get and keep a patent? How do these costs vary from one country to another? And then very importantly, and the real heart of this talk today, how to manage those costs. And Jim is going to give us some pruning tips, so to speak. We seem to have gone back a slide. John, if you could move forwards. Thank you. We're going to have, Jim will be giving us some pruning tips on how to prune an IP portfolio to ensure that it remains effective within a budget. And crucially, how to pick the winners. And at that point, I'm sure that Arthur will have some very useful insights from his experience working in-house. Relevant to managing costs through a period like this is the possibility of deferring some costs without losing value if possible. And then finally, we're going to look at how to get a good return on your investment or good value for money from your investment in your IP and patent portfolio. So first of all, I'd just like to take a little bit look a little bit at what's happened historically. According to the information available, we've been through 3 recent recessions in the UK, not including the one we're entering now by all accounts. The so-called early 80s recession in the 1980s, and the so-called 90s recession in the 90s, and then the so-called Great Recession around about 2008 following the financial crash. And as you can see, next slide, the effect of the Great Recession, the 2008 recession, was the deepest, and potentially the one we're about to enter maybe even deeper. So we're going to focus on that one. If I could go to the next slide. On this chart, at the top, you can see the same graph that I've put in the previous slide, showing where the recessions lie since the early 1980s through to the current time. And in the bottom, I've tracked that, tried to match up the timelines as best I can, showing the number of patent applications filed by UK residents. There's something odd going on at the beginning in the early 80s, but let's just focus on sort of what happened from the end of the 90s recession through to the present time, and particularly the 2008 recession. And it looks to me from this chart as if there is potentially a slight tailing off of UK applications filed by UK residents in the wake of the 2008 recession. But I have to say that when you look at the timeline as a whole and the trend as a whole, there are far greater effects at play, in particular this sort of bump in filings around about the 1998 through to about 2002, which I suspect was probably something to do with the dot-com boom around that time, potentially. And also there was an increased filing in sort of biotech patents, particularly gene patents around that time, which then did tail off. So it's hard to distinguish the drop in filings around about 2008 from the longer term trends. So then I thought perhaps there's a sort of sector by sector aspect to this. So if we could have the next slide. This slide breaks down the filings, UK applications by different technology areas, not all of them, of course, but I chose a few that might be illustrative, including computer technology, pharmaceuticals, biotech, mechanical engineering, sort of pumps and engines and so on, all in the different colors there that you can see. And they all seem to follow pretty much the same trend. The green line, which relates to engines and pumps, shows a sort of a long-term recovery, I suppose, after the 1980s, when manufacturing industry in this country was severely damaged. But for the most part, they all show a bump around about 2000 and then a drop off. And again, you know, potentially some reduction in filings in the wake of 2008, but pretty much sort of drowned out by the longer term picture. So I don't think that really shows very much in the way of the impact of a recession. If we could have the next slide. You know, I wondered perhaps if what was happening after a recession or during a recession was that UK applicants were filing the same number of UK applications, but perhaps filing fewer foreign applications. And these are only applications filed in the UK and abroad by UK residents. I excluded foreign applications by foreign entities, of course, because they may have experienced the recession in a different way or at a different time. But again, whilst there is possibly a flattening in the curve just after 2008, or there certainly is a flattening in the curve, it doesn't really show anything significant compared with the longer term trends. John, next slide, please. So then I thought, well, perhaps what's happening is people are filing the applications, but then they're abandoning them at some point, perhaps more frequently than they would otherwise, to try and save costs during the economic downturn. And maybe that was an effect which would be more pronounced for foreign applications, with people being more prone to abandon foreign cases before they would abandon their UK ones for obvious reasons. But if anything, actually, it shows that the number of foreign patents granted to UK residents sort of showed less of a downturn than the number of UK patents granted to UK residents. So that wasn't very helpful. If we could have the next slide, please, John. So just briefly wrapping up this part, I think, you know, trying to look back at what's happened historically at times of recession, and most particularly the Great Recession, so-called, in 2008, it seems to me on the data that recessions have a very minor impact on patenting activities by UK applicants, at least, certainly by comparison with longer term trends. And it certainly seems to be the case that patenting continues through a recession. You know, and I'd perhaps turn to the panel at this stage. Is that's your experience too, Arthur, maybe?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I can confirm what you're saying. That's what we are experiencing at BizPack right now. We did not steer away from the strategy we established before the coronavirus crisis. And as a matter of fact, we actually filed the regular number of priority filings for this first half of 2020. And I would say that for us, it's very important to keep innovating so that we can go over this crisis and be ready for the after crisis. And I think innovating actually is probably the most important strategy to keep going, to face the change of paradigm we may see in the next few years. I mean, it's probably also the fact that we are quite a conservative industry in terms of patent filings compared to the big data company working in the IT field. And for us, having a strong patent portfolio is really key to achieve our commercial and business objectives, I would say. Mm. I could even probably the change I could think of eventually will be that we will be probably more stringent on the quality of the applications we will file and not probably look at having a large volume of patents, but more of a higher quality portfolio. But that's probably a trend that can be seen in the whole IP field. I mean, I can see that for the last 10 years, the data available in terms of priority applications, etc., is very easy to get now with all the search platforms, the way it is organized. And that could also have an impact on the way people approach IP nowadays, so that they know better what is a patent landscape before even innovating, so they are not going to hit a wall later by facing FTO problems. Yeah, I mean, I think that just follows this trend of increasing the quality and probably not the quantity. I mean, I've recently seen the comparison between portfolios of companies that are in these traditional industries. For example, I see that Tesla seems to have less IPs than Renault, but we can understand that Tesla may be more of a breakthrough company, I can say.
Mm-hmm.
And the same seems to be true for, if you compare Dyson and Bosch, for example. It seems like Dyson is very innovative and is aiming more for a high quality portfolio rather than a large quantity one.
That's an interesting observation, Arthur. Thanks for that. So you're saying that perhaps the more apparently innovative companies, or the more sort of, let's say, the new players, seem to be sort of focusing more on sort of quality rather than just bashing out quantity in terms of patent filings.
I mean, that is our position, and that's what I've seen for the companies that are of interest for me, which may not be true for the whole all the industries.
Okay, well, look, let's move on and start looking at some costs associated with patenting, because if you're going to manage an IP budget effectively, you need to have a good handle on the costs. And Jim, if I could turn to you perhaps to sort of walk through that.
Of course, yeah. I was going to add maybe the from what you've said, Julian, and Arthur said, the way in which companies are behaving in this current crisis probably is dependent on the type of company and the type of sector they're in. And whilst there might not be a massive change in patent activity as a whole, I see different companies and different sectors behaving very differently. But the one thing I do see in common with all companies at the moment is there is an increased focus more than ever on ensuring that those companies have sustainable businesses, sustainable business models, and making sure their IP position reflects the need of the business, with, as we'll see, and I'll talk about a bit now, a focus on costs and keeping costs under control. So this slide and the next one are about that, and just illustrating the need to understand and manage costs to make sure that is being managed effectively. So the slide here shows the costs year on year of patenting a single invention in a selection of territories, 5 European countries, Spain, Germany, France, UK and Italy, and also US and China, by using the PCT route and a UK first filing. So these are very rough figures for an average patent spec, for an average length, for relatively straightforward technology, filing in English, but not abandoning any rights at any stage. So obviously there'll be some cases and scenarios that might end up with cheaper overall costs, and some may be more expensive, but this is just to sort of illustrate how costs might rack up. The green colours on the bars show prosecution costs, and red show renewal costs. And the renewal costs I've provided here are inclusive of local agents fees and a renewals payment service company. This one is based on the figures from CPA Global, so I'm thankful for them for providing me with those figures. The year one here is the PCT filing date, so that the last renewals that are paid are shown in year 20. That means I've actually got some costs in year 0 and year -1. So year -1, there might be some searching done. Then we come to drafting and filing a new UK patent application, and the next year filing a PCT, then entering the national phase, going through the prosecution, and eventually all the cases getting granted around year 6, year 7, with the renewal fees then taking over. The blue line you see on the graph shows the costs, well, the cumulative costs with time, and you'll see they reach about £160,000 by year 20, and that it's a fairly steady progression to that. So probably about half the costs are reached at around sort of year 10, halfway in, which means the last 10 years are effectively all renewal fees and account to 50% of the costs overall. So the main conclusion I'd like to draw from this slide is just not sustainable to file multiple patent families and keep all the rights forever. I know, Arthur, you've had some thoughts on this and how you manage to not keep cases in force forever. Do you want to just have a quick word about that now?
Yes, thanks, Jim. I found your visual very interesting because in this visual we can clearly see why we apply checkpoints at a certain lifetime of the patent application and the patent family as a whole. I mean, the first checkpoint we have is obviously at year 0. That's when we are filing the priority application, and here is the question of how many inventions are we going to file? How related are they? And how can we eventually bundle them together? There are pros and cons in doing this, and we are going to come back to this a bit later, so I will not extend on this for now. But what we can see as well is that when there is another spike when you go into national phase, which is actually our next checkpoint, because we know that the environment changes, and so the way we decided to file the IP at year 0 may have changed at year 2, and that's every time there is consequent expenditures coming up that we need to do these checks. So this year in here, the national phase, we review the list of countries where we want to have protection. And interestingly, at BESPAC, we have 2 lists of countries, a long list, which covers the majority of key countries for the pharma and medtech industry, and a shorter list, which basically consists in Europe, USA, and Japan. Then we have another checkpoint at year 10, and you can see that's when the cost of the renewals is starting to ramp up. And here we review this list of countries. Do we want to reduce it or not? How did the product linked to the patent reach its expectations or not? And we are going to do the same check at year 15, which will be before the big spike you can see at year 16, which actually matches the renewals for the US applications. As in the US, you don't pay renewals on a yearly basis, but every few years. And so we do the same check just before this. And this is not only a check focused on the US application, but on all countries at once as well.
Great. Okay, so should we move on to the next slide, where I've illustrated the same costs over the course of 20 years, but divided by territory. So just to explain here, moving from left to right, I've got the pre-PCT costs shown in green, again green being the sort of non-renewal costs, and then moving to the right, the PCT filing and dealing with things in the international phase, then the European patent application costs with a few maintenance fees shown in dark red there, then the validations in France, Germany, Italy, UK and Spain, which includes some translation costs, but mostly renewal fees. So the renewal fees there are shown in dark red and light red or pink. The dark red colours there show the renewal fees that are payable up until year 10, with the lighter sort of pink colour showing the renewal fees from years 11 onwards. And then on the far right, the costs in US and China. The 2 things I thought about what's been shown here is that it was firstly surprised me a little bit to see that the costs for US and China weren't that far apart. I know it probably differs according to an individual case, but you might expect the US prosecution costs to be quite expensive compared to China, but then of course China might have some more translation costs involved. And the renewal fees, as they stacked up, showed that paying renewal fees in China, if you go up to year 20, is possibly slightly more expensive than in the US, and it kind of overall balances out. The other thing that's shown here is that European validations can be expensive when it comes to paying the renewal fees. And roughly speaking, I think 70% of the renewal fees payable on this example are from the European application or the European validation countries. I know, Arthur, you've got some thoughts on what that might cause you to do as a manager of IP.
Yeah, so I mean, you can still again see that this matches a bit with the checkpoint I was mentioning before. But what we can see as well is that a lot of the cost actually comes after the prosecution is completed, and that can make the decision of abandoning a patent very difficult, because it's very difficult to basically throw away something you just acquired. And but if the IP is used less, it's actually throwing good money after bad in a way. And I know that these decisions are very difficult. We always think, could we actually license this this IP? Is there another way to recycle it, etc.? So we always find excuse not to take the decision. But during that time, the renewals still keep coming. So I think sometimes it's very hard decisions, but they need to be made.
Yeah, it's very interesting. My takeaway from this is really clearly that there's the very significant proportion of costs which are due to renewals. And I think from our side of the fence, Arthur, we often sort of omit that because at that stage it's out of our hands. You know, but even the costs of Italy, where a translation is needed, pale into insignificance next to the renewal costs in that country. So this takes us really on to the question of funneling, Jim. I know you've words to say about that. You know, this idea about sort of perhaps dropping things midway when they're no longer needed or no longer valuable.
Yeah, I think what the previous charts showing how costs can build up if you keep a patent family going for 20 years shows is that if you've got a strategy of filing patents, you also need to have a strategy for abandoning patents or stopping the costs at stages. And Arthur's mentioned the stage gates and the points at which his company deals with making sure they're not spending costs on patents needlessly. But of course, the difficulty with patents is knowing how to pick the winners. And there are no magic crystal balls available. So how can you predict years in advance which of your patent rights are going to be the winners? It's a very difficult and tricky business. And I think the one thing I've learned over the years is that there is no shame in getting it wrong. And sometimes with the benefit of hindsight, you might make the wrong decisions. But this is one way I've seen companies trying to increase their chances of picking the winners whilst keeping costs under control. And I think people have called it funneling because basically the model looks a bit like a funnel. You're funneling out to get the winners at the end. So the theory is you're going to increase your chances of picking the right winner in advance if you back more runners at the outset. So that means trying to encourage more invention disclosures and making sure that of those invention disclosures, you sift out some and don't proceed with all of them. And then you might move on to some first filings. But if you're going to pick lots of runners at the outset, you need to keep control over the costs over the life cycle of each case. And perhaps from your first filings, you might not proceed with a PCT or national phase for all of them and cut out some of that stage. And then again, if you're going down the PCT route, you might want to decide not to go ahead with some of those PCTs and keep on funneling down so that when you go through the national phase and get some grants through, you keep a regular check on the renewal fees that are being paid, and you make sure you're not paying every year the renewal fees without reducing the size. And then provided you're asking the right questions at the right stage, you would hope that your chances of picking the winners at the end would have been increased because you've started off with more runners at the start, rather than trying to pick the winners at the outset and going through for a sort of a 20-year renewed portfolio, which is going to cost a fortune. You probably might not have the best best decisions, so the best information available to make the right decisions at the start. So the model does require a very sort of robust decision-making process, that you do actually reduce the portfolio at relevant stages during the life cycle. Arthur, did you have anything to add about?
Yes, I can relate to what you just said, because this is pretty much the way we operate in BestPack. I think that the first stage of capturing invention disclosures is actually a job in itself. I mean, you need to constantly monitor what are the researchers, the engineers doing, because if you're not there, they will not always come naturally to you. And so that's why, interestingly, in BestPack, the IP is part of the R&D department, so that allows us to have very clear communications. And so we are filing a lot of invention disclosures, but at BestPack, the purpose of doing this is also to record our trade secrets. As you may know, there's been a directive not a long time ago that requires us to really document our trade secrets so that we can enforce them properly, because you need to know what are your trade secrets, basically. And it's also a better way for the executives in the company to understand where is the value in terms of IP. It's not only patents, it's also about trade secrets. And in terms of funneling, I think this is very much led by the IP strategy. And so then the question is, how do you set up this IP strategy? We have a system structure in place at BestPack. I'd like to describe it a bit later, but in terms of output, we actually defined the IP strategy very well at BestPack. So we know that for us, what is important primarily is to have FTO. So we want to be able to manufacture for our clients. So actually, having a patent for us is an enabler of, is allowing us to be able to contract some new manufacturing opportunities with the pharmaceutical clients by showing that we have components that they are looking for, that are protected, and also that we have the full FTO, because that's something we monitor actively. And how to get FTO in another way is actually to file a patent application. You don't have to take it through to grant. You can abandon it sometimes on the way. As long as you have your core IP protected, you lower the risk of someone copying your core technology. It's less important to have the surrounding technologies publicly disclosed in this case.
That's interesting. There's lots we could talk about there, and perhaps we will towards the end. But as time is marching on, I suggest, Jim, if we move on to your next slide, sure. You're going to give some guidance about how to prune the garden of IP.
Yes, fine. So I mean, there are plenty of tools available for doing this, and I'd hope that the sort of sophisticated users of IP out there have already got the strategies in place for abandoning cases in any case. But it does seem that during the current environment, companies are being required to reduce IP budgets by a certain percentage, or are being forced to reduce portfolios to save costs. And that seems to have given an increased focus on this subject. So I've been advising some clients about how they might make these decisions objectively. And for those people who haven't got access to the paid for IP management tools out there, I've been suggesting people can just use a simple Excel spreadsheet and rank their portfolio by using some metrics. And if the company chooses appropriate criterion, marks each patent or patent family using the same metrics, you can then rank your patent rights or patent families in order of perceived value, and then see those at the bottom are probably the ones that are more likely to want to be abandoned. So the sort of things that companies might want to consider, and I accept that there are different things, different factors that might be perceived differently by different companies, but I'd hope that for most people, the financial factors are going to be one of the most important, perhaps the only criteria on which to judge how valuable patents are. So a bit of a cost-benefit analysis, if you like. Looking on the cost side, what the cost of prosecuting, maintaining the patent might be in the future. If actually maintaining the case isn't that expensive, then there's less of a benefit to abandoning it. On the flip side, you want to be looking at what value your IP is delivering out of the patent or patent family. Is it making money or allowing a company to save money? Are there patent generating royalties that are attached to the patent? Is it allowing greater margins to be obtained? If not now, what about how likely is that in the future? And of course, if there's sort of patent box benefit, the patent might be perceived as being more important and valuable either now and in the future. Other factors that might be considered, though, what I've sort of termed external factors. So that includes things like the nature of the product or technology, how valuable or unique is the product or technology that's covered by the patent, and then the nature of the market for the technology, so the customers, what size of value is the market opportunity now or in the near future. Then also external competition, what's the value of the patent against competitors? Does it relate to technology that's very desirable to the competitors? And that might be something to take into account too. And also on the external side of things, the freedom to operate. If there's not freedom to operate, then how valuable is the patent covering that technology to you? And that might be a factor to consider. And then moving on to things that I call internal factors. These are more sort of technical or legal issues. How inventive or how valid is the patent now or likely to be? Is it clearly strong and valid, or are there serious concerns over validity? What's the claim scope like? Are the claims really broad and therefore potentially very valuable, or are they actually just fairly narrow and focused on a specific need? And then how easy is it to detect infringement by others? How easy will it be to police the patent? There are various ways in which these things can be measured, and there's technology available out there to help companies assess those things, the sort of external landscape and also internal validity, and there are kind of patent mapping tools out there to help you assess those, or somebody who's familiar with the patent portfolio could go through and make their own assessment. There might of course be some other things that sort of overarching considerations. There may be some contractual obligations to keep a patent in force, in which case it's very difficult to abandon without dealing with those contractual issues. And there might be some territorial things that come into play, so it might be very important to the business to have protection in a certain country, in which case that might trump some of these other considerations. Or it might be that you've suddenly moved out of a certain territory, it's no longer of interest, and that can give an opportunity for cost savings there by abandoning rights in that territory. So those are just a very, very quick run through of the kind of things that you might consider when ranking patents in order to decide which you might abandon. I think, Arthur, you might have some things to add on how you do that in practice as well.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think you summarized well the different criteria that we need to assess when looking at an invention or a patent application. I mean, it's not only relevant to assess if an application should be abandoned or not. It's also relevant at the very early stage, I think. But we can see that this is coming from a lot of different I would say business fields. I mean, we have the financial aspect, the commercial aspect, technological aspect, the legal aspect. So it's very difficult to put all these different decisions together, and you need to get the feedback, the expertise from all the different players in the company to get to a conclusion. And we have to recognize that people working in commercial and R&D, etc., they have their daily job which is not focused on IP, and it can be very disruptive for them to answer these questions on a daily basis. And so that's why I developed a structure at BasePack to help deal with these different elements. So we have an IP forum for each of the R&D departments, which is dealing with the operational aspect of IP management that includes looking in detail about which application we should abandon or pursue. But then it's following a strategy that has been developed by an overarching entity, which is the IP committee. And so the IP committee defines the IP strategy based on the business objectives. I think that for us, it really helped to focus on what we should and not do, what is distraction, what is not a distraction. I think that, for example, for us, patenting broadly, trying to block anyone is a distraction. We want to focus on having good quality product that we can actually sell. Also, you can think that some of these distractions could be a patent that is probably only filed in one jurisdiction, but it's in the portfolio. So every time you go through the portfolio, you have to remind yourself what is it about, why do we need it, etc. So this has actually an indirect cost as well, and we should not forget that our time is costly as well. Also, in terms of contractual obligations, I had a comment on this. I can see that, again, I think it's a different point of view from people working with different objectives. What we see from a contract for us IP professionals is not the same than for someone working in commercial. And I believe that this is because for us, the life cycle of an item we're working on is 10, 20 years. For commercial people, it may be 2-3 years. So I think it's very important for an IP professional to be involved in the term sheet when concluding licensing, etc. Otherwise, you get locked in eventually having to file in too many countries, or the fees do not fit with what you know about the portfolio, etc. Yes. Also in terms of assessing the different patents, there's another tool I developed for many years, which is actually very simple but very helpful. I call it technology IP system, and I can see that, Jim, you put that next to patent mapping, which is it's basically what it is. It is simply taking your devices, looking at the different features, and matching them with all the different patent applications you have. In this way, you will identify the gaps and also the overlaps. So if you have two patent applications covering two surrounding technologies, but they work in synergy, one cannot work with the other, and they have a similar expiry date, what is the point of keeping those two patent applications? That's an example here. And so probably also a point is around core and surrounding technologies. I think we need to identify what is core to your business and what are the surrounding technologies. So for the core technologies, you maybe want to be to focus your expenditures and your efforts on these core technologies, and probably be a bit more loose on the surrounding technologies, except if they can lengthen the lifetime of your product.
That's interesting, Arthur. Thanks for that. And coming back to the question of territories, we've had a question come in from one of our delegates on the question of EU and whether it's necessary to validate European patents in all EU 27, as it is now, countries in order to protect yourself against the possibility of parallel imports. I mean, without giving away any secrets, obviously, what's your opinion on that?
I believe that it is the same question that can be applied to all the different regions. I mean, here we speak about Europe. So the question then will be in how many countries do you need to have protection so that it deters a competitor from entering the rest of the countries? Probably in the Europe, we always speak about the big five. I mean, UK, France, Germany, Spain, Italy. That's probably the key countries you need to have because entering in the other countries without having access to one of these big five will not be cost effective. Obviously, that depends in which industry you are. That's true for us, medtech, medical device industry. It's probably not true for a pharmaceutical company who is trying to sell their drugs in each of the different countries. And we see that pharmaceutical company usually file patents in pretty much all the available countries.
Right.
And that's probably true as well for South America. For example, Brazil is the most important country to have. Is probably less important to have the others. And by having only Brazil, eventually you will be able to sell a license for the whole South America. That could be the same in Europe. If you have a IP for for the big five, you will be able to sell a license for the whole European region.
Very interesting. I mean, if your business, of course, is licensing rather than sort of necessarily just keeping out competitors, you know, one tactic some clients of mine have used is to include in the license agreement a sort of so-called minimum set of countries, which is if we have a granted patent in let's say UK, Germany, France, and Italy, and then maybe US and Japan or somewhere else as well, then we qualify for royalties on a worldwide basis, which is a way of sort of maintaining, you know, ensuring that we can at least get royalties from our licensees without needing patents in every single country. So there are ways that you can do it contractually as well, I guess. I think we probably need to move on in view of time. Jim, do you want to just talk about opportunities in, you know, particularly at times like this when costs can be not necessarily cut, but at least deferred in some way? There's some tactics here that can be used.
Yeah, sure. I'll just run through a few of these quickly then. So one thing I guess I should say with all of this is that using delaying tactics and deferring things can increase costs overall or incur a bit more risk. But if the primary aim is to push costs back, then there are various things you can do. So you can, of course, just delay making some of these new filings, and also the risk of that is you're going to push back your priority date to a day in the future. So it's not without risk, but that is just one very simple tactic. Another is for new filings that have been made and there haven't been any public disclosures to date is to abandon and refile and reset the priority date. Again, not without risk because you're losing a filing date in the process, but by doing so, pushing costs back in terms of PCT or national phase filings or prosecution costs. Another tactic that has been used and can continue to be used is to bundle inventions together. So if you're engaging in multiple filings over a period of time in related areas, you could consider putting what might have traditionally been several patent applications into a single application and using that to carry some other inventions along with a single application where you're only paying single lots of filing fees and can rely on the ability to file divisionals at a later date.
This is something we do at BestPack, yes, from time to time. I mean, of course, there is again, I speak about core and surrounding technologies. I like these concepts. So we have the core technology we know we want to protect. And then there is a series of other embodiments that are related to it that we are not sure if we'd like to actually spend money on protecting them before knowing if the product is going to be successful. So a way to delay these costs for us is to integrate these embodiments in the specification of the priority filing so that we could file a divisional or continuation on them later if the product becomes successful, so that we have a stronger protection around the whole device itself. Of course, there is a risk by doing this. and the risk is that you're disclosing some prior art. And in the future, if you realize that actually it's not exactly the invention that is going to be successful or going to work, and you make modifications, then not fitting with the scope of the priority application, you may not be able to refile a new application protecting this exact new invention you redeveloped.
Yeah, and the other issue, of course, is that you end up with longer patent specifications, and that can cause extra cost with translations and the like at a later date if you're not careful on how you manage a bundled patent application. There are other tricks that patent attorneys can play in terms of getting delay into the system. Obviously, I'd recommend people talk to their patent attorneys about what tricks can be played. We can get extensions of time. In Europe, you can use the further processing procedure to get some extra time at a little extra cost and a bit of more risk there. But that can buy 3 months, 4 months or so by using that procedure. And when it comes to European grants, and if you're going ahead in multiple jurisdictions with a validation in, say, 5 or more countries, the renewal fees can be quite a jump from those that are paid directly to the European Patent Office. So keeping an eye on that and possibly delaying the grant phase by effectively rejecting the text that's been approved for grant and using delaying tactics there can actually push costs back and save a bit of money overall as well. So another question we've been asked is how can we provide the same value for less money? And here I was going to quote a former partner of Abel Inimeray who liked saying, "I would have drafted a shorter patent spec if you'd allowed me more time to write it." But when we had our practice run through, Julian piped up and said that the quote had actually originated from Winston Churchill, who apparently said something like, "If I had more time, I would have written you a short letter." But of course, Arthur's got the last laugh here, because it turns out that the notion was probably originally the creation of Blaise Pascal. But what I wanted to say here really was, if you invest early on in getting your patent specification as originally filed, carefully prepared, precisely drafted, a shorter and more focused patent specification with well-targeted claims and good fallback positions, you will benefit from cheaper translation costs when it comes to going ahead in foreign territories, and one would hope a cheaper and more straightforward prosecution, and therefore saving costs overall. The difficulty with that in the current environment is that it probably does require a little bit more investment up front. Arthur, I know you've got a few things to say perhaps on that.
Yes, I mean, you may know that I started my career by working on patent landscaping, etc. And so I'm very knowledgeable about how do you prepare an R&D program based on patent landscaping with the aim to be able to have a strong IP. And for me, I think it's just the whole innovation process that should be documented with IP data, and so that's even more true when we go to patent filing. I hear a lot of why don't we just file and look at what the search report will come back with, and we can deal with it later. And I don't think this is the right strategy, because first, you may spend money on prosecutions that's not going to go anywhere, on a patent drafting that's not going to work, and as well, you really want to understand the whole space. And in addition to that, the search report sometimes does not come up with documents that will then later be retrieved by the patent examiner. So for me, I think it's very important to have a very clean and well-documented and patent application that is taking into account all the risks that we can assess at that time. And it's better than delaying the cost that will cumulatively be bigger than they are spent at the beginning.
I think that's right, Arthur. I mean, of course, you know, filing and with a request for a search can be in many cases indeed can be the best way forwards. In my experience, for a range of clients, because you can easily spend, you know, if you don't have somebody of your expertise in house, for example, and you need to go outside for that landscaping expertise, you can spend easily as much as it would have cost you to prepare and file the application in the first place. You know, just on the searching before you've even put pen to paper. And then, of course, if you request the search early enough before you disclose anything, then you do have the option of going back after having received the UK search, which is pretty inexpensive next to the costs of an external landscape searcher, to go back and have another think. But in general, you're absolutely right. You know, preparing a decent specification first. I mean, remember, you and I worked on that case when you were at HVivo, where we came across some extremely close prior art, but we knew that there was a difference. At least conceptually between the invention and the art. And we rehearsed the arguments with the inventors over several months before carefully putting them in the application. And of course, the European examiner then did exactly what we predicted him or her to do. And we had the answers ready, and indeed the answers were in the specification, which then led to an immediate provisional allowance after filing a demand. So that's a great instance of where that preparatory work that you talked about can work. Not only that, but preparing proper fallback positions can greatly reduce the cost of prosecution, where you don't get tangled up in these endless arguments with examiners about the wording before you're even getting into the substance of novelty or inventive step. You know, if you can deal with everything on the substance in one office action and not get caught up in sort of arguments about things which could and should have been sorted out at the drafting stage, then so much the better. And the other thing I would say is that in the context of a portfolio of any reasonable size, of course, that initial investment up front starts to become relatively small next to the ongoing cost of prosecution that we saw from Jim's charts later on. We are sort of running really into the last few minutes. I think if we could just move on to the next slide. Jim, did you want to talk about sorry, I think it was the slide before actually, John. On the...
Well, I think we've mentioned it already, but there are obviously alternatives to patents in terms of getting value out of an IP portfolio, and Arthur's mentioned trade secrets, but there are things like utility models, registered designs, and other IP protection routes available. And just to explain the last two bullet points on the value for money slide, go national early. What I mean by that is avoiding the PCT route altogether, which does add cost overall. So if you, as a company, know you're only going to go ahead in a limited number of territories, you can bring forward the national phase cost, which brings costs forward but reduces cost overall by leaving out the PCT fees that are payable. And obviously, the other thing I mentioned there is PPH, the patent prosecution highway. It tends to make things a bit faster, but in my experience has actually smoothed prosecution and made things cheaper overall. So again, these things bring costs forward, but do enable companies with larger portfolios perhaps to get better value for money overall.
Mm. Thank you, Jim. Right, so for the next slide then, John, thank you. Just to summarize everything we've heard, and very quickly, I'm very conscious of not abusing people's time. And of course, if there are any sort of specific issues you would like to explore with us in more detail, the contact details are at the end, and we invite you to get in touch with either us or if you have an advisor to do so. But clearly, investing early is a key part of what we've been saying to ensure that the ongoing costs of a patent application up until the point when it's granted or dead or abandoned are as efficient as possible. Having in place a proper procedure for reviewing the entire portfolio as a whole, and not just bit by bit as and when the latest bit of email arrives from your patent attorney saying, do you want to spend this or that, is a very sort of helpful and sensible thing to do. And again, likewise, reviewing sort of regularly and not ad hoc. Certainly being selective and picking the winners, as Arthur says, avoiding the temptation just to keep something because you've got it. It can be a very expensive thing to have in your pocket that's not being used. So being selective and making sure that you're consulting widely with your colleagues in the business to make sure that the IP is actually aligned with business strategy, whether that's protecting the core technology, whether it's disclosing peripheral things or overlapping things just for the sake of ensuring freedom to operate, or whether it's to ensure fulfillment with licensing terms that you've entered into. All of that is very important. And of course, it's not just about filing more applications, it's about filing quality applications to ensure you are protecting what the business needs you to protect, and crucially making sure you also have freedom to operate. We have had a number of questions in advance. There's one on the screen here, which is, can we recommend any IP management tools or software which might be available? Arthur, with your background, would you like to answer that briefly, if you have any recommendations?
Yes, I'll try to be short.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of tools that I'm using, and I mean, when you speak about IP management tools, I understand that this is not about patent searching. This is about visuals and trying to show the strengths of a portfolio or a patent. I mean, I think these tools are interesting, but more to have a view of the whole portfolio. How is your portfolio comparing with competitors one, for example, or to show to your upper management how is your portfolio structured, and again, how does it compare with the competition? What are the strengths and weakness? But when it comes to assessing families or applications one by one, I believe that you need a lot of different information to put together, and it will depend on your business strategy as well. And then I believe that probably it's best to use eventually Excel, so that you can have all the different criteria we discussed before and put a weight for each of the different criteria according to your IP strategy, and then do the ranking with also some soft data, not just numbers. Yeah. I think it's we should probably move away from the era of 140 characters on Twitter, and I think that these are complex discussions, and they need to be very well informed.
Yeah, I agree with that, Arthur. And if we've got time, just a couple of minutes, there's one more question. I think it's all we've got time for, which is somebody's asked, how can we best manage renewal costs during this kind of downturn? Jim, have you got some thoughts about how we can manage renewal costs?
Well, I mean, there have been some of the minor extensions given by some of the patent offices around the world in view of the COVID crisis. Use those. Those are not going to give you very much in the way of a grace period. But then there are the other grace periods available for paying renewal fees late. Of course, that's going to incur extra costs. So it's not necessarily about saving costs, but it could be used to defer cost if there are cash flow issues for business. But I think the main message I would provide here is what we've been talking about throughout our talk is actually having a robust procedure in place for abandoning patent rights at the relevant time, and making sure you have the stayed gates and decision-making process in the business to enable you to do that. Of course, in terms of getting best value for money, if you're using a renewals service provider, make sure the extra costs over and above the official fees are representative of the value you're getting out of that service provider. And there are ways in which you can shop around or get discounts depending on your circumstances. But look at that as well, I'd suggest.
Excellent. Well, I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, hats off to the UK office, who, of course, have allowed the 6-month extension of time for renewing a patent to be done up until March, I think it is, next year for free. And that can usually be a 50% increase in the renewal costs. That's a good thing. Right. Well, I think we need to wrap up there. We are just past the hour. For the panelists, I just ask you to look at your Skype invitations shortly after the panel. I'd like to thank you both very much for taking part. Jim, looking forward to seeing you in the office one day in the
yes, me too.
in the future. And Arthur, lovely to see you. Thank you ever so much for your valuable contributions. Of course, great friend of mine, great friend of the firm. And I'm sure you've contributed invaluably to this today, and we're very, very grateful to you for that. And thank you to John behind the scenes for moving the slides. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you on another Able and Nimere webinar in the near future. And with that, I think I shall close the meeting. Thank you very much.